Welcome to Staying with the Trouble. I'm Bishop James Jones, and in this podcast series I'll be focusing on issues of poverty and exclusion in the city of Leeds with some of the people who are staying with those troubles. My guest in this episode is Simon Phillips, an Interfaith Leader and Community Engagement Officer with Leeds Jewish Housing Association. He tells me how the stigma of poverty affects Jewish people in Leeds and of the important ways in which the City Council engages with faith communities. Simon, you are deeply embedded in the life of the City of Leeds. You know its positives and its negatives. What are the issues? What's the trouble that faces Leeds in 2022?
There's a lot of trouble facing Leeds. I'll start with my own Jewish community. For us, and sadly would have been the same answer maybe 50, 60 years ago, the trouble is rising levels of AntiSemitism. So the Community Security Trust, which is the organisation who monitor anti-Semitism in the Jewish community, they recently completed their report looking at 2021 for anti-Semitic incidents. There was a 34% rise in anti-Semitic incidents across the country, and that included 105 incidents in West Yorkshire, of which I would say the majority were in Leeds, where the Jewish community are. And I think the challenge for the Leeds Jewish community is that's the first trouble, I would say, really. The second thing is, and I'm thinking as a member of the Leeds Jewish Housing Association, which is my main professional role, is we're seeing rising fuel prices, rising energy bills. And as a social housing provider, we're really concerned about the ability of our tenants to continue paying rent. How do we support our tenants who are facing rent arrears? What do we do if they say, can't pay my rent this month because I need to heat the home, I need to clothe the children, I need to put 3 square meals on the table? How can we actually meet the needs of our tenants? And I think the third and perhaps most recently identified trouble for the Jewish community is what's happening in Ukraine, and how the Jewish community can reach out to the unfortunately growing number of refugees which are arriving from Ukraine. There's a real Jewish heritage in Ukraine. So I think perhaps more than a lot of other refugee crises, this has really touched the Jewish community, because these are people we have our ancestors there. Well, part of the community do. And
you personally, I gather, have roots in Eastern Europe and Ukraine itself.
Yes, well, not in Ukraine. My ancestors were in Lithuania, and just to inject some levity here. So my surname is Phillips. Now it was anglicised to Phillips from Vishkis. That was the original name, and obviously my first name is Simon. So sort of the equivalent in Russia and Lithuania would be, sort of Zalman. So I suppose in theory I could be called Zalman Fishkes, which could be misheard as salmon fish cakes. But the thing about it is, but yes, my roots are in Lithuania.
How does that shape your understanding now about what's happening to the Jewish community?
Well, for me, I'm conscious of the fact that, but for circumstances, I might not be here talking to you. And when I say I might not be here talking to you, there's the sense of, my relatives came over from Eastern Europe at the end of the 19th century. That's the first thing. But of course, there's obviously the spectre of the Holocaust. And, who knows where I would be if there wasn't a Holocaust. And, there's all sorts of quirks of fate in the Jewish community. And so I think from my point of view, it's remembering where we've come from, keeping the memories alive of our ancestors, where we were born, where there used to be big Jewish populations, But I think we have an obligation to celebrate the fact that the Jewish people are alive. We often have this expression of, Am Yisrael Chai, the Jewish nation of Jewish people live. And when I say Am Yisrael Chai, I'm not talking about the land of Israel, the state. I'm talking about the Jewish people, the nation, Israel, the nation. We have this obligation to continue Jewish prayer, Jewish culture, all the celebrations, all the rites of passage that goes with it, really. So it's really a chain in generations for hundreds or thousands of years.
You may not want to answer this question, so forgive me if it's too personal, but have you yourself experienced anti-Semitism in the city?
I haven't, to be honest with you, in terms of it being directed against me. There's an awful lot of things that I've seen online, again, not directed against me, but potentially directed against the Jewish community in Leeds or nationally, and that does concern me. I think to myself, is there a reason why I haven't been a victim? Although I don't always like the word, victim. But I'm just conscious that the spectre is there, and I think one thing I would say is that often there's a concern that because a lot of Jewish people are not always recognisably Jewish, I could walk down the street and you wouldn't know I was Jewish. I think in some senses that type of racism doesn't always receive the amount of coverage that it might when compared to other forms of racism.
And have you found the other faith communities supportive of the Jewish community, standing alongside you, combating the anti-Semitism?
I have, and in fact there's a lovely incident that happened a couple of years ago. So my synagogue it's the Etz Chaim synagogue on Harrogate Road in North Leeds. And a few years ago there was graffiti there, and it was cleared off. But 3 or 4 members of the Muslim community came along and they brought bouquets of flowers. And that was, it was such a lovely gesture. But unfortunately, they couldn't be invited in. And this links to anti-Semitism because places of worship, like synagogues, are supposed to be places of welcome, places of sanctuary, open to everyone. But unfortunately, because of security issues around the Jewish community, you can't just walk into a synagogue and say, here are some flowers, can I have a look around? You can have a look around, but you need to make an appointment. There's not an open door policy, unfortunately, not physically.
But that example of the Muslim community coming to you with the flowers is a hopeful sign, isn't it? Because most people's perception is that, these two communities, never the twain shall meet.
Yes, and I must admit, having been involved in interfaith work for much of my life, there's always the risk that the proverbial elephant in the room of what is happening in the Middle East can compromise interfaith relations. And there have been a few examples, both in Leeds and in Manchester, where, burgeoning interfaith relationships have sort of come to a halt. But I am very, very hopeful. And one thing to stress here is that just because an incident is happening to another group, that doesn't mean that it's the responsibility of that group to report and to stand up against it. And as somebody from the Jewish community, I recognise I have a role to play in standing up against Islamophobia, for example. And I'd like to think that in Leeds we have a really, really strong fabric of interfaith relationships where we will stand up literally and metaphorically against injustice, whether that is relating to racial injustice or poverty and inequality.
And is that also true of the city council? You talk about the other faith communities being supportive. Do you feel that the city authorities recognise the contribution of the faith communities and particularly of the Jewish community?
I think they do, and I think they always have done. There's numerous illustrations of that. I mean, every year when it's the festival of Hanukkah, there's always a civic Hanukkah lighting ceremony outside the town hall, and usually you'll get either a lucky or unlucky councillor who will have to go up in one of those cherry pickers to light the huge menorah. So there's that. It's a case of Judaism very much being in the public square. And actually, I tell you what's happening more recently in Leeds. So what's going to happen is that when there's various festivals, civic buildings are going to be lit up in different colours, potentially correlating to colours associated with certain festivals. So, for example, blue is always associated with Judaism, orange is often associated with Sikhism, potentially green with Islam. So I think the council do demonstrate their commitment to supporting faith communities, and perhaps a really good example of that, another good example, is the Covenant for Engagement, the Faith Covenant.
How did that come about?
So the Covenant for Engagement is something which was conceived by the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Faith and Society, which at the moment is chaired by Right Honourable Stephen Timms MP. And the idea behind the Covenant is to get faith communities and local authorities together and have commitments on both sides to building relationships, working together to tackle injustices, consultation work. There's an interesting debate to be had about the word covenant, because of course covenant is very much an Abrahamic concept, and of course when we talk about interfaith relationships, we're not talking about just Christianity, Islam and Judaism. We're talking about a wide range of faiths, and indeed belief systems which don't have God there, for example. So the Covenant for Engagement was initially launched in Birmingham. It's also been launched in Coventry and in Preston. It was launched in Leeds about 5 or 6 years ago. It was launched in a blaze of publicity and sort of fizzled out. But only now is it being rejuvenated, really.
And what sort of practical things would flow from such a covenant, either in Leeds or in any other city that you know of?
Well, it could be, as I say, I mentioned consultations. It could be providing advice on public health matters. It could be providing advice on religious literacy in the council. It could be being plugged into key faith contacts when there's an incident which requires people to be visibly together on the town hall steps, for example. I mean, to a large extent, I know it's about action rather than words. The fact that there is a document, which is a covenant, which sets out commitments, I think is significant in itself, really. Leeds City Council have a dedicated faith team, a dedicated Leeds Faith email address, and I'd like to think that the amount of faith engagement is increasing.
Good. To discover that there's a Jewish housing association is quite a surprise to me. What was the origin of the association?
So the association was set up in 1953. So we're celebrating our 70th anniversary next year. And it was set up with the recognition that there were Jewish people who wanted to live in the recognisably Jewish area of Leeds, which is sort of Moortown and or Woodley, where the synagogues were, where the Jewish bakery and butchers were, but couldn't necessarily afford the rents there, couldn't necessarily afford to buy. So the idea was to construct affordable housing in the heart of the Jewish community. It is an ethnic minority housing association, but not all of our residents are Jewish. We actually actively have to accept non-Jewish tenants, but we do have, Jewish ethos. We do things when it's Jewish festivals. We won't be open. The office won't be open on the Sabbath. So we are, we like to think of ourselves as one of the vanguard organisations in Leeds, being at the heart of the community and providing the opportunity for people who might have studied in Leeds to remain in Leeds and have affordable housing.
And all of us have to handle stereotypes of ourselves, and I suppose one of the stereotypes of the Jewish community is that it's wealthy, that it's very good at supporting one another. The question is, well, what needs are there in the Jewish community that warrant having such an association? Because you seem to be a community that really has everything, well knit together.
Yeah, I'd like to say that one of the reasons why things are well knit together is because we're a small community. In Leeds, the population is anywhere between 6,000 and 8,000, depending on how you define membership, whether it's, people who identify, let's say they're Jewish in the census, or a member of a synagogue, or whether you include the transient student population. But, there's always been this concern for social welfare in the Jewish community. What we need to remember is that when Jewish people came to the UK, they arrived as, poor people with some skills, but people were living in, the slums and in the inner city areas, and gradually over the years, the Jewish community has, integrated, got involved in business, and has gradually moved north in Leeds. But the thing is, you've still got a need for social support. As well as the Leeds Jewish Housing Association, we have the Leeds Jewish Welfare Board, which grew out of the Leeds Jewish Board of Guardians, really, again set up in the 19th century. So, there is a real need for charity in the Jewish community, and it's often something which isn't really seen. There's still a stigma attached to social housing generally, but unfortunately there is a stigma in the Jewish community attached to people who aren't as affluent or do. What's
the root of that stigma?
I don't know. I mean, it could be people leaving their humble roots behind and thinking, right, I'm going to look forward. I've made myself. Why can't other people make something of themselves? I don't know. It's a difficult one, and maybe there isn't an answer to that.
And does the Jewish Housing Association help those people beyond providing social housing?
One of the things that we have as part of our budget is we have something called a Helping Hands Fund. Now, the Helping Hands Fund is something which allows tenants, whether they're just moving into a property or whether they've been living with us for quite some time, to apply for a small grant for essentials. That could be they need a new washing machine, they need a new bed, they need some kind of repair doing which we wouldn't do as part of our obligations. And the way it works is that somebody will approach us in a very, very discreet manner to say, look, I'm having real problems, fridge is broken down, I really can't afford it, I want to prioritise paying the rent and putting food on the table for the kids, can you help? And they apply for the grant, we assess whether we feel it's warranted to do that, and we'll provide the grant. And there's quite a few. There was somebody else who moved from a one-bed house to a two-bed house because they'd recently split up from their partner, but they wanted their kids to stay and they wanted some bunk beds. And again, they applied for this grant because they said, if I can't afford a bed, I can't see my kids, it'll affect my mental health. And obviously every case is different, but the fact that we have this fund in place epitomises the fact that there's a need. There's clearly a need, and we are always seeking grants to bolster our Helping Hands Fund.
And the sense of responsibility for those who haven't made it, where does that come from within the Jewish faith?
Well, one route is there was a philosopher in the Middle Ages in Spain called Rabbi Moses ben Maimon, and he spoke about 8 levels of charity. And incidentally, when we talk about charity in Judaism, there's 2 concepts of charity. There's something called tzedakah, which is a bit like sadaqah in Islam, and tzedakah is physically giving money to different charities. But then we have this concept of gemilat chasadim, which is doing good deeds. It's not necessarily physically parting with money. it's volunteering. There's always been a culture of volunteering. But Rabbi Moses ben Maimon spoke about 8 levels of charity. And it ranges from helping somebody out before they become impoverished, so identifying a potential need, giving somebody a step up on the ladder or something, or doing a particular good deed. Right at the bottom is when somebody does a good deed grudgingly. They've been forced into do it. They don't really want to, but maybe they had. So there's 8 different levels, and I mean that's just one concept of doing good deeds in Judaism. I think it's that morality, it's that ethical package that you would see in most faiths, really.
When I was a student doing theology, I was taught Hebrew by a rabbi. Please don't question me because I think I've forgotten most of it. But one word that stands out from those lessons is that the root of the word for compassion in Hebrew is womb. And when the scriptures speak of God having compassion for his people, it is in effect God has a womb like a mother for his people. And that came to mind when I discovered that Leeds styles itself as the city of compassion. And I think from a Jewish perspective, that Leeds looks after its citizens like a mother would look after the children that have come forth from her womb. Do you see Leeds as a compassionate city?
So yes, Leeds sees itself as a compassionate city. And again, we have essentially a secular local authority that again is injecting religious precepts as well as, faith covenant, the idea of compassionate city. And I think by that it wants to tackle poverty and inequality. But as part of the council's best city ambition, it talks about 8 different priorities. But one thing which runs through it is the idea of making it a safe city. And I think that's safe in terms of being financially safe. It's safe in terms of being safe on transport. And of course, it's safe in terms of keeping its citizens safe, which links into a lot of work that the council does in the area of women's safety, for example. One of the projects I'm involved in is it's the aim to make Leeds the first women-friendly city in the UK. And linked to that is there was a survey that was done last year. It was a women's safety survey done by an organisation called Women's Lives Leeds. So I'd like to think that the council looks after its citizens and looks after its established citizens who have been here for many, many years, but also looks after new arrivals as well. And of course, with what is on the horizon with Ukraine, that's going to be ever more important to be a welcoming city. And
you talked about the Jewish community in Ukraine and talked about your own community here in Leeds. Are you finding that your people are reaching out now? Are some of them offering their homes to welcome in refugees?
They are, and in fact the Leeds Jewish Housing Association are actually making 3 or 4 of our properties available to refugees. We've already shown somebody round from a local service. We want to be able to do that. We want to show that we are a compassionate community, but also, although we are a Jewish housing association, we want to show that yes, we have those Jewish values. We do provide a need for the Jewish community, but equally, we welcome the stranger. We were strangers in a strange land, as is quoted on various occasions in the Torah, the Old Testament. So that's one way that the community is reaching out. We're also part of a national Jewish community task force which looks at Ukraine. And there's all sorts of different coordinated community responses to do with Ukraine. I should stress, though, that that's not to say that we're putting all our eggs into this particular basket. We recognise it's very, very important to understand the many other situations around the world where there's people in need.
This diaspora experience, Do you think that that gives you as a faith community special insight into the needs of refugees and asylum seekers, and not just special insight, but within the interfaith context, a story to tell to encourage others who may not have that perspective?
Well, I saw a photograph last week, and it showed thousands of refugees on a train platform. I think it might have been a train platform just near the border of Poland and Ukraine. And you could have said, oh, that's from the 1930s. And I think for us in the Jewish community, we see these images, and it's not just in Ukraine. We see these images of people fleeing their homes, carrying whatever they can with them. And we say, that was us 100 years ago. We have a responsibility to say, we want to welcome you because people welcomed us. I think that's obligation to give something back. And of course, it's sad that in the 21st century, we are seeing history repeat itself. And sadly, the way of the world is that history is likely to repeat itself. There will be another refugee crisis somewhere in another couple of years. Unfortunately, that's the world we live in. I know that sounds like a very negative concept, but
it's realistic about the trouble that lies ahead, and there you are, if I can change the metaphor now, at the coalface, it seems to me. And I just wonder what sustains you, because the thing about history is that it teaches you the pain as well as everything else. And as you contemplate the future and where it might lead, inside yourself there must be a sigh, and I wonder where you gain your strength from to gird up your loins and go forward.
I gain my strength from the Torah, the scripture that we read each week. There's a lot of bad things that happen, but there's an awful lot of positive things in there. There's a lot of great role models, great stories. And I strongly believe that often we need to go back to, our ancient scriptures for the ideas that guide us today. I'm always a bit sceptical about these books around self-help and self-improvement, psychological improvement, because my view is there's something wrong with the world when people are aiming to improve themselves by picking up a book which has been written by a lay person, when there's books which have been written thousands of years ago, which really should be our guiding principles. And it's amazing, you pick up the Torah, or you could pick up the New Testament as well, open it to a random page, and I can guarantee there'll be an idea there which you can relate to your current life. And I think that's what sustains me, that there's always a message there.
Simon Phillips, thank you very much, and God bless you.
Thank you very much.
Staying with the Trouble is brought to you by the William Temple Foundation and Leeds Church Institute. The interviews were recorded at Chapel FM in Seacroft. The series was produced by Rosie Dawson.